Seymour's specific claim was absurd, Dickens' indignant exactitude about every jot and tittle of authorship was also inappropriate and misleading. The Pickwick Papers, when all is said and done, did emerge out of a haze of suggestions and proposals in which more than one person was involved. The publishers failed to base the story on a Nimrod club, but they succeeded in basing it on a club. Seymour, by his virtue of idiosyncrasy, if he did not create, brought about the creation of Mr. Winkle. Seymour sketched Mr. Pickwick as a tall, thin man. Mr. Chapman, apparently without any word from Dickens, boldly turned him into a short, fat man. Chapman took the type from a corpulent old dandy named Foster, who wore tights and gaiters and lived at Richmond. In this sense, we were affected by this idle aspect of the thing. We might call Chapman the real originator of Pickwick. But as I have suggested, originating Pickwick is not the point. It was quite easy to originate Pickwick. The difficulty was to write it. However such things may be, there can be no question of the result of this chaos. In the Pickwick Papers, Dickens sprang suddenly from a comparatively low level to a very high one, to the levels of Sketches by Boz. He never afterwards descended. To the level of the Pickwick Papers it is doubtful if he ever afterwards rose. Pickwick indeed is not a good novel, but it is not a bad novel, for it is not a novel at all. In one sense, indeed, it is something nobler than a novel, for no novel with a plot and a proper termination can emit that sense of everlasting youth, a sense as of the gods gone wandering in England. This is not a novel, for all novels have an end, and Pickwick, properly speaking, has no end. He is equal unto the angels. The point at which, as a fact, we find the printer matter terminates is not an end in any artistic sense of the word. Even as a boy I believe there was some more pages that were torn out of my copy, and I am looking for them still. The book might have been cut short anywhere else. It might have been cut short after Mr. Pickwick was released by Mr. Nupkins, or after Mr. Pickwick was fished out of the water, or at 100 other places. And we should still have known that this was not really the story's end. We should have known that Mr. Pickwick was still having the same high adventures on the same high roads. As it happens, the book ends after Mr. Pickwick has taken a house in the neighborhood of Dulwich. But we know he did not stop there. We know he broke out, that he took again the road of the high adventures. We know that if we take it ourselves in any acre of England, we may come suddenly upon him in a lane. But this relation of Pickwick to the strict form of fiction demands a further word, which should indeed be said in any case before the consideration of any or all of the Dickens tales. Dickens's work is not to be reckoned in any novels at all. Dickens's work is to be reckoned always by characters, sometimes by groups, oftener by episodes, but never by novels. You cannot discuss whether Nicholas Nickleby is a good novel, or whether Our Mutual Friend is a bad novel. Strictly, there is no such novel as Nicholas Nickleby. There is no such novel as Our Mutual Friend. They are simply lengths cut from the following and mixed substance called Dickens, a substance of which any given length will be certain to contain a given proportion of brilliant or of bad stuff. You can say, according to your assumptions, the Crummles part is perfect, or the Boffins are a mistake, just as a man watching a river go by him could count here a floating flower, and then a streak of scum. But you cannot artistically divide the Outpost into two books. The best of his work can be found in the worst of his works. The Tale of Two Cities is a good novel. Little Dorrit is not a good novel. But the description of the Circumlocution Office in Little Dorrit is quite as good as the description of Tellson's Bank in The Tale of Two Cities. The Old Curiosity Shop is not so good as David Copperfield, but Swiveller is quite as good as Micawber. Nor is there any reason why the superb creatures, as a general rule, should be in one novel any more than the other. There is no reason why Sam Weller, in the course of his wanderings, should not wander into Nicholas Nickleby. There is no reason why Major Bagstock, in his brisk way, should not walk straight out of Dombey and Son and straight into Martin Chuzzlewit. To this generalization some modification should be added. Pickwick stands by itself, and has even a sort of unity and not pretending to unity. David Copperfield, in a less degree, stands by itself, as being the only book in which Dickens wrote of himself, and The Tale of Two Cities stands by itself as being the only book in which Dickens slightly altered himself. But as a whole, this should be firmly grasped that the units of Dickens, the primary elements, are not the stories, but the characters who affect the stories, or more often still, the characters who do not affect the stories. This is a plain matter, but, unless it be stated and felt, Dickens may be greatly misunderstood and greatly underrated. For not only is his whole machinery directed to facilitating the self-display of certain characters, but something more deep and more unmodern still is also true of him. It is also true that all the moving machinery exists only to display entirely static character. Things in the Dickens story shift and change only in order to give us glimpses of great characters that do not change at all. If we had a sequel of Pickwick 10 years afterwards, Pickwick would be exactly the same age. We know he would not have fallen into that strange and beautiful second childhood which soothed and simplified the end of Colonel Newcome. Newcome, throughout the book, is in an atmosphere of time. Pickwick, throughout the book, is not. This will probably be taken by most modern people as praise of Thackeray and dispraise of Dickens. But this only shows how few modern people understand Dickens. It also shows how few understand the faiths and the fables of mankind. The matter can only be roughly stated in one way. Dickens did not strictly make a literature, he made a mythology. For a few years our corner of Western Europe has had a fancy for this thing we call fiction, that is, for writing down our own lives or similar lives in order to look at them. But though we call it fiction, it differs from older literatures chiefly in being less fictitious. It imitates not only life, but the limitations of life, and not only reproduces life, it reproduces death. But outside us, in every other country, in every other age, there has been going on from the beginning a more fictitious kind of fiction. I mean the kind now called folklore, the literature of the people. Our modern novels, which deal with men as they are chiefly produced by a small and educated section of society. But this other literature deals with men greater than they are, with demigods and heroes, and that is far too important a matter to be trusted to the educated classes. The fashioning of these portents is a popular trade, like ploughing or bricklaying. The men who made hedges, the men who made ditches, were the men who made deities. Men could not elect their kings, but they could elect their gods. So we find ourselves faced with a fundamental contrast between what is called fiction and what is called folklore. The one exhibits an abnormal degree of dexterity operating within our daily limitations. The other exhibits quite normal desires extended beyond those limitations. Fiction means the common things are seen by the uncommon people. Fairy tales mean the uncommon things as seen by the common people. As our world advances through history towards its present epoch, it becomes more specialist, less democratic, and folklore turns gradually into fiction. But it is only slowly that the old elfin fire fades into the light of common realism. For ages after our characters have dressed up in the clothes of mortals, they betray the blood of the gods. Even our phraseology is full of relics of this. When a modern novel is devoted to the bewilderments of a weak young clerk who cannot decide which woman he wants to marry, or which new religion he believes in, we still give this knock-kneed cad the name of the hero, the name which is the crown of Achilles. The popular preference for a story with a happy ending is not, or at least was not, a mere sweet-stuff optimism. It is the remains of the old idea of the triumph of the dragon-slayer, the ultimate hypothesis of the man beloved of heaven. But there is another and more intangible trace of this fading supernaturalism, a trace very vivid to the reader, but very elusive to the critic. It is a certain air of endlessness in the episode.